The courthouse stood like a monument to order and restraint. Its tall, sand-colored columns reached into the gray morning sky, casting long shadows across the steps where people climbed steadily inside. Every footstep on the stone echoed faintly, mingling with the hushed murmurs of conversations, the occasional nervous laugh, and the scuff of polished shoes. It was the kind of morning where everything felt routine, predictable, almost ceremonial. Inside, the courtroom itself radiated an air of solemnity. Wooden benches lined both sides, polished smooth by decades of restless spectators and anxious defendants. The faint scent of old varnish and paper lingered in the air, mixed with a hint of coffee drifting from the hall. Fluorescent lights glowed steadily overhead, humming faintly, adding to the rhythm of the morning. The room was neither welcoming nor hostile, just neutral, as though it waited patiently for human affairs to pass through it like waves. Near the front, the judge's bench rose above the rest of the room, a broad slab of dark oak, carved with authority. Behind it, the judge's chair sat empty for the moment, a symbol of power waiting to be occupied. The flags of both the United States and the state hung on either side, their colors muted under the pale glow of the lights. To the right, the witness stand waited like a small island, and opposite it, the clerk's desk was already neatly stacked with files. In the gallery, a slow trickle of people found their seats. Some carried folders and briefcases, others merely clutched their hands tightly in their laps. Attorneys sat forward with a certain stiffness, their suits crisp, their expressions carefully controlled. Defendants shifted uncomfortably, tugging at their collars or adjusting their ties. Family members sat close together, whispering, occasionally glancing toward the front, as though the sight alone could prepare them for what was to come. And then there was the officer, standing tall near the jury box. His uniform was pressed to perfection, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Beside him sat his partner, a large German shepherd, muscles taut even while resting. The dog's fur shone with health, its ears perked, its eyes constantly scanning. It was a familiar sight to many. The courthouse often hosted cases where K-9 units played a role. Yet still, the animal commanded attention. Even sitting quietly, it exuded a sense of restrained power, the kind that made people instinctively wary. The leash in the officer's hand looked like the thinnest thread holding back something far stronger. Most people avoided staring too long. Adults knew better than to challenge the steady gaze of a police dog, especially in a room where order was expected. They lowered their eyes, focusing on papers, or pretended interest in the wood grain of the benches. But one pair of eyes did not look away. At the far end of the gallery sat a young mother with her son. She looked out of place in the sea of suits and uniforms, her posture tense, one hand clutching her purse, while the other tried to keep her child settled. The boy, no more than 3 years old, was a bundle of restless energy. His legs swung freely from the bench, his shoes knocking softly against the wood in an irregular rhythm. His mother whispered to him gently, smoothing his hair, urging him to stay still, but his wide eyes betrayed a fascination too strong to be subdued. He was staring directly at the dog. The German shepherd shifted slightly, adjusting its weight, and the boy's gaze followed every movement. His head tilted, his lips parted in curiosity. For him, the courtroom was not a place of law or authority. It was a place where an enormous animal sat only a few yards away, and that was far more interesting than men in robes or suits. The boy whispered questions his mother tried to ignore. She pressed a finger to her lips, a silent plea for him to be quiet, but his attention had already locked onto the dog, as though the two were in their own private world. Meanwhile, at the front of the room, the clerk adjusted her glasses and shuffled her papers into neat stacks. Each file represented a life about to be dissected under the law. She glanced at the clock, noting the time. Soon the judge would enter, and the day would officially begin. The atmosphere shifted as anticipation grew. Lawyers straightened their ties, pens clicked softly, and whispers hushed. The bailiff, a broad man with a voice that carried easily, moved toward the side door. With practiced authority, he called the room to order. All rise. The scrape of benches and the shuffle of feet filled the air as everyone stood. The side door opened, and the judge entered, an older man with silver hair neatly combed. Back, his robe flowing behind him like a shadow. His face was lined with years of stern decisions, his expression carved into a permanent mask of authority. He moved with steady, deliberate steps to the bench, where he sat with a slow nod, surveying the room. "You may be seated." The command was simple, but it carried the weight of ritual. Everyone obeyed at once, the benches creaking as the audience settled. The judge adjusted his glasses, glanced at the docket in front of him, and began preparing to speak. The room fell quiet again, save for the faint hum of the lights and the occasional rustle of papers. On the surface, it was like countless mornings before, structured, calm, predictable. Yet under that quiet surface, small currents of tension rippled. Defendants waited for their names to be called. Attorneys rehearsed their opening remarks. In their minds, and family members braced themselves for verdicts that could change lives. And in the midst of it all, a boy stared at a dog. The child's feet tapped against the bench again, creating a steady rhythm that only his mother noticed. She leaned down, whispering in his ear, but he paid her no mind. His eyes followed the German shepherd's every move, the twitch of an ear, the slow blink of its eyes, the way its chest rose and fell with calm, steady breaths. To him, this wasn't just a police dog. It was something alive, something powerful, something that pulled his attention with magnetic force. The officer holding the leash stood stiff, his eyes forward, focused on the judge. To him, the boy was just another distraction in the gallery, not worth his notice. His focus was on maintaining composure, on projecting professionalism. His grip on the leash was casual but firm, as though confident that nothing unexpected could happen here. But the boy's curiosity only grew stronger. He leaned forward, his small hands gripping the edge of the bench as though trying to get closer. His lips moved in a whisper. His mother tried desperately to shush. She pressed a finger to his mouth, then pulled him gently back against her, murmuring reassurances meant more for herself than for him. The judge cleared his throat, adjusting the stack of papers before him. His voice, when it finally broke the silence, was deep and deliberate, each word carefully measured. He began to read the first case, his tone authoritative, his presence commanding. The attorneys straightened in response, their pens poised, their faces attentive. The court had begun. Yet in the back row, one child was no longer listening. The boy's eyes sparkled with determination as he studied the police dog. To him, the animal was not a symbol of authority, not a piece of evidence, not even a working partner to the officer. To him, it was simply a dog, one that carried a weight he could not yet understand, but instinctively recognized. His world was smaller, simpler, stripped of the caution adults had learned. He had no fear of authority, no restraint in speaking his mind. And in that quiet courtroom, where silence was meant to reign, his voice would soon become the loudest sound of all. The boy's presence in the courtroom seemed, at first, like a mere footnote. He was only 3 years old, after all too young to understand the weight of what was unfolding before him. To the adults around him, he was a distraction at best, a complication at worst. The court was no place for children, yet life rarely respected such neat boundaries. His mother had no choice. She could not leave him at home, and she could not abandon her duty to appear that day. So she brought him along, clinging to the hope that he would sit quietly, invisible among the adults. The boy, however, had no intention of being invisible. From the moment they entered, his small body radiated energy. His legs, still unsteady in their rhythm, swung freely beneath the wooden bench. The sound of his shoes thumping against the frame echoed faintly, a rhythm only he seemed to enjoy. He hummed under his breath, a sound that blended awkwardly with the solemn stillness of the courtroom. His mother placed a gentle hand on his knee, a silent plea for stillness, but her son's eyes were already elsewhere. What captivated him was not the judge, nor the polished benches, nor the lawyers whispering urgently to their clients. It was the animal, large, strong, steady, sitting at the front, beside the officer in uniform. The German shepherd was unlike any dog he had seen before. Its fur gleamed under the sterile lights, and its posture was straight, proud, like a statue carved to honor vigilance. Yet its eyes were alive, sharp and watchful. They scanned the room in calm arcs, taking in every motion, every twitch, every sound. To the adults, the dog was a presence to be respected and perhaps avoided. But to the boy, it was an irresistible mystery. He tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mommy," he whispered, his voice high and urgent. "Doggy." She glanced toward the front, her lips tightening. She pressed a finger to her mouth and gave him a stern look. She whispered, "We have to be quiet here." But the boy was relentless. His attention refused to waver. He leaned forward, his small hands gripping the bench as though the wood could bring him closer to the dog. He studied the way its ears twitched, the way its chest rose and fell with slow, steady breaths. Every detail fascinated him. In his young mind, the dog was not just an animal. It was a character, a figure larger than life, holding secrets only he could unlock. His mother, meanwhile, shifted nervously. She could feel the eyes of others turning toward her, small glances of irritation. A child had no place in the solemn gravity of a courtroom. She smoothed his hair, whispered calming words, even pulled a toy car from her purse to distract him. But the boy pushed it aside. No plastic trinket could compete with the real living creature only a few yards away. The attorneys shuffled their papers, oblivious to the child's fixation. The clerk tapped her pen against her notes. The judge cleared his throat, preparing to speak. And still, the boy's eyes never moved. At one point, the dog shifted its position, its paw stretching slightly, claws clicking faintly against the polished floor. To anyone else, it was a minor movement. To the boy, it was electrifying. His breath caught in his throat. He turned to his mother, wide-eyed, tugging at her sleeve again. "Doggy moved," he whispered urgently, as though he had discovered something profound. His mother exhaled, her patience fraying. She pulled him into her side, holding him against her, as though proximity would keep him calm. But his gaze, unwavering and intense, still fixed on the animal. For the boy, the courtroom was not a place of law and order. It was a stage, and the dog was the star. The lawyers, the judge, the solemn rituals, they were background noise compared to the presence of that creature. The boy's world was smaller, stripped of pretense and ceremony. He saw things for what they were, not for what society dressed them to be. The dog, sensing the gaze, flicked its ear and turned its head briefly toward the gallery. Its dark eyes met the boy's, and for a fleeting second, there was a connection. The boy's lips curled into a grin, small teeth flashing as though he had been recognized, acknowledged by the animal he adored. He leaned forward even more, nearly toppling from the bench in his eagerness. His mother caught him by the arm just in time, pulling him back with a sharp whisper. "Sit still, please." But the boy wriggled in her grip, undeterred. He was determined, in the way only a child can be. In his mind, the courtroom and its rules were irrelevant. He did not understand silence, obedience, or authority. He understood only curiosity and the pull of the mysterious dog that seemed both familiar and strange. Around him, adults remained locked in their roles. The bailiff watched the clock, ready to announce the next order. Attorneys reviewed their arguments, their minds already racing ahead to the cases they would present. The judge adjusted his robe, preparing his opening remarks. All believed they controlled the flow of the morning, that their actions alone defined the weight of the proceedings. None of them realized the energy that simmered quietly in the back row, waiting to burst forth. The mother's anxiety deepened with every passing second. She knew her son too well. She knew that his silence was temporary, fragile, hanging by a thread. She could feel the restless energy gathering within him, and no amount of whispered warnings could hold it back for long. She glanced around the room, hoping desperately that no one else noticed. But a few spectators had already begun exchanging looks, small smiles tugging at their lips. They had seen what the judge and lawyers had not, that a storm was brewing, in the form of a 3-year-old boy with unshakable focus. The dog turned its head back toward the front, its gaze steady once more. Yet the boy's mind had already made a leap. He whispered softly, almost to himself, but loud enough for his mother to hear. "Doggy bites." Her heart skipped. She placed her hand firmly over his small one, shaking her head rapidly. "No," she whispered, her voice almost trembling. "Don't say that. You don't say that here." But the boy's eyes gleamed. He had noticed something in the dog, something that adults either ignored or buried beneath layers of respect and fear. He saw not just a partner to the officer, not just a symbol of authority, but a creature capable of harm. And in his innocence, he did not yet know the weight of saying such a thing aloud. The courtroom moved forward, the judge finally beginning his remarks, his voice filling the chamber. But the boy's world had narrowed to a single point, his attention coiled tight like a spring. His small chest rose and fell rapidly. His legs stopped swinging. His lips parted. The child was ready to speak. And when he did, his words would cut through the courtroom with a force no lawyer, no judge, no officer could anticipate. The courtroom always seemed to change the moment the judge sat down. Before his arrival, it was just a room full of benches and desks, full of anticipation, but still casual in tone. Attorneys whispered, clerks shuffled papers, and nervous defendants wrung their hands or leaned against their lawyers for whispered reassurance. But once the judge entered, the air grew heavier, thicker, charged with an invisible current of authority. This morning was no exception. The older man in the dark robe adjusted his chair and lifted the docket before him. His glasses rested low on his nose, and when he looked over them, the expression in his eyes carried the weight of years spent in rooms just like this one. He had presided over hundreds, no, thousands of hearings. The faces changed, the names shifted, but the rhythm remained. To him, the courthouse was less a place of drama than of routine. A problem entered, a process unfolded, and a decision was reached. Still, even routine carried ceremony. He cleared his throat, his voice breaking the silence with an authority that felt both ordinary and immense. This court is now in session. The clerk straightened at her desk, pen poised. Lawyers raised their chins, signaling readiness. The bailiff adjusted his stance by the door, his watchful eyes sweeping the room. Every movement now had purpose. On the docket today, the judge began, his voice steady, measured, a sound designed to command attention. Papers rustled as attorneys checked their notes. The judge's words echoed off the wooden walls, bouncing back with gravity. Each syllable carried the weight of law, a kind of sound that could change lives with a flick of a pen. The courtroom, which just moments ago had been filled with idle whispers and restless fidgeting, now sat in hushed stillness, every ear tuned toward the bench. But not every ear. In the back row, the small boy shifted restlessly in his seat. His mother had her arm around him, her hand resting on his knee, trying desperately to keep him still. She had told him they must be quiet, that this was not a place for talking. But he was only 3 years old, and 3-year-olds have little patience for solemn rituals. The boy tried to listen to the judge, if only for a moment. The man's voice was deep and slow, and the child's eyes followed his lips as they moved. But soon his attention drifted. Words like docket, case, and hearing meant nothing to him. They were sounds without meaning, heavy syllables wrapped in seriousness. His mind wandered quickly back to what truly held his fascination. The dog. The German shepherd sat in its place, ever watchful, ever still. To the boy, it was not just an animal, but something alive in the middle of all this stillness, something that didn't wear suits or hold papers or speak in heavy voices. He leaned forward, watching intently, almost daring the dog to move again. His legs swung faster beneath the bench. His mother whispered urgently, "Please, stay still," but he barely heard her. The judge, meanwhile, continued. His voice set the rhythm of the morning. He spoke of cases scheduled, motions filed, procedures to follow. Attorneys nodded in acknowledgement, scribbling notes, their pens scratching across yellow legal pads. For the lawyers, this was routine but still vital. They lived in these words, in the rules and rhythms of the court. They understood the necessity of precision, the way a single phrase could shift an argument or decide a case. Yet outside their world of codes and citations, the boy fidgeted. He tugged at the sleeve of his shirt, yawned loudly enough for his mother to press her hand against his mouth, and then slipped free, pointing once more toward the front. "Doggy," he whispered. "She." His mother pleaded, her cheeks flushing as she noticed a few heads turning. She hugged him tightly against her side, rocking gently as though motion might calm him. But his small body resisted, wriggling free again. His determination was quiet but unstoppable. The judge paused briefly to sip water, adjusting his robe. Before continuing, he noticed nothing unusual in the gallery. His focus remained on the docket. Case numbers, charges, scheduled appearances, he recited them like steps in a well-rehearsed play. He trusted the bailiff and clerk to handle distractions. His role was to maintain order and guide the process, not to monitor restless spectators. But the officer standing near the jury box noticed. He had felt the child's eyes on his partner, the dog, from the beginning. At first, he ignored it. Children were always fascinated by the animal. But the persistence of that stare made him uneasy. He shifted slightly, tightening his grip on the leash as if to remind the dog, and perhaps himself, that control was absolute. The dog, however, remained calm, unmoved by the child's attention. Its training was deep, its discipline unshakable. It sat tall, watching the judge, oblivious or perhaps indifferent to the fascination it inspired in the small boy. The boy, however, felt the pull grow stronger. It was as though the entire courtroom, the judge, the lawyers, the papers, the flags faded away, leaving only himself and the dog. He studied its every move, the twitch of its ear, the way its nose flared slightly as it breathed, the stillness of its paws against the floor. He wanted to speak to it, to name what he felt. Words bubbled at the back of his throat, pressing forward, eager to escape. His mother felt the shift in his body, the way he stiffened with intent. She bent low, whispering furiously, "Don't. Please don't." Her voice cracked slightly, a mix of fear and pleading. She knew her son too well. She could feel that something was about to happen. And in that moment, the courtroom was a study in contrasts. At the front, the judge continued. to speak, his tone steady, carrying the authority of the state. The attorneys leaned in, pens scratching, faces intent. The clerk jotted notes with quiet precision. The officer stood rigid, hand firm on the leash, projecting control. And in the back, a child prepared to break the silence. The boy inhaled deeply, his small chest rising. His eyes locked onto the dog with unwavering focus. His lips parted slightly. His mother gripped his arm, her face pale with dread. But still, the words gathered inside him, ready to burst forth with the innocent honesty only a child could wield. The judge turned a page, pausing for just a fraction of a second before continuing. His voice echoed across the wooden walls, filling every corner of the room. He was unaware that the most important interruption of the morning was about to come not from a lawyer's objection, not from a clerk's correction, but from the smallest, youngest voice in the room. The tension was invisible to most, but it simmered beneath the surface like a quiet storm. And as the judge leaned forward, ready to continue, the storm prepared to break. The judge's voice filled the courtroom like a steady drumbeat, deep and deliberate, each word measured to carry authority. He leaned forward slightly, his glasses glinting beneath the fluorescent lights as he turned a page from the docket. The air was thick with stillness, a collective silence that seemed to anchor everyone in place. Defendants waited with tense faces, lawyers scribbled notes, and family members clutched their hands tightly in their laps. The officer beside the jury box stood motionless, his hand wrapped casually around the leash of the German shepherd at his side. The dog remained the picture of discipline, steady, alert, yet calm. All appeared orderly, at least on the surface. But in the back row, a storm had been quietly building. The boy could no longer contain himself. For the entire morning, he had battled the invisible weight of his mother's whispered warnings, her gentle but firm hand pressing him still, her finger against her lips to signal silence. He had tried, in his own small way, to obey. He had tapped his shoes against the bench to release his energy, whispered into her sleeve, clutched his toy car only to push it aside again. But his focus always returned to the animal at the front of the room. The dog fascinated him. It wasn't just a creature. It was a mystery, a force. It sat so still, so calm, yet the boy sensed something underneath its quietness. Its strength was obvious, even to his young eyes. And he knew, though no adult had told him, that this dog was different. Not like the pets in his neighborhood. Not like the dogs he saw at the park. This one was dangerous. He could feel it in the way its body tensed even in stillness, in the sharpness of its eyes, in the leash held firmly by the officer's hand. The boy's chest rose and fell quickly. His eyes widened. His mother sensed the shift, the way his body grew stiff as if preparing for something. She bent toward him, her voice a whisper sharp with urgency. "Don't. Please, don't say anything." But the words had already gathered inside him, bubbling up from the simple honesty only a child could possess. He didn't know about rules of order, about consequences, about the weight of silence in a courtroom. He knew only what he felt, that the dog was not what it seemed, that the truth needed to be spoken. The judge leaned closer to his microphone, his voice rumbling low. And in the matter of, the boy's small voice cut across his words like a bell shattering the calm. "Doggy." It was not loud at first, more like an excited announcement than an interruption. Heads turned. Instinctively, eyes searching the back row. The boy's mother flushed red, her hand clamping over his mouth, her whispers frantic. "Quiet, please." The judge paused, brows knitting as he looked toward the gallery. A few chuckles rippled softly through the room, quickly silenced by the judge's stern glance. He had seen it before, children disrupting with questions or noise, but he expected it to end quickly, tucked away with a parent's firm hand. But this child was not finished. A boy squirmed free of his mother's hand, his face red with determination. His voice rose higher this time, clear and strong, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "Bad doggy!" The courtroom froze. Every head turned sharply now. The officer stiffened, his grip on the leash tightening. The German shepherd lifted its head slightly, ears perked, its body still calm, but aware of the sudden energy directed toward it. The mother's hands trembled as she tried to pull her son back against her chest, whispering desperate apologies to no one in particular. And then the boy shouted again, his words like a hammer, breaking the fragile stillness. "Bad doggy! You bite people!" Gasps filled the room. The gavel in the judge's hand froze mid-air. His lips parted, but no sound emerged. Attorneys exchanged glances, some wide-eyed, some narrowing with suspicion. Spectators leaned forward, whispers breaking like waves through the gallery. Even the bailiff shifted uneasily, his eyes flicking between the boy, the mother, and the miller. Dog at the front of the room. The officer beside the dog's leash stood rigid, his jaw tightening. His face was composed, but the stiffness of his posture betrayed unease. He gave a quick tug on the leash, as though reasserting control not of the dog, but of the room's perception. The dog, however, seemed unbothered. It sat tall, ears pricked, tongue slipping briefly from its mouth before disappearing again. To the animal, the boy's outburst meant nothing. But to the humans in the room, those words carried weight. The truth, or at least the perception of it, had been spoken in the simplest way, and it had come from the unfiltered mouth of a child. The judge slowly lowered his gavel, placing it gently against the wood. His eyes, sharp and searching, moved toward the back row. The boy sat upright now, his face glowing with the satisfaction of having spoken what he believed. His mother clutched him tightly, her face pale with shame and fear. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the kind of silence that demanded acknowledgement, that pressed against the walls until someone filled it. The judge cleared his throat, but no words came immediately. He, a man who had controlled countless courtrooms with the sheer weight of his voice, found himself momentarily disarmed by a child's uninvited testimony. For the boy, it was not testimony at all. It was truth, spoken without hesitation. He knew no other way. The gallery buzzed softly with murmurs. A woman whispered to her neighbor, "Did you hear what he said?" A man shook his head, frowning, his eyes fixed on the officer and his dog. Another stifled a nervous laugh, the absurdity of the interruption mixing uneasily with the seriousness of the proceedings. The judge finally spoke, his voice quieter than before, but firm. "Order." The word echoed, yet it lacked its usual finality. The gavel tapped once, but the sound was hesitant, almost restrained. He looked at the mother, his eyes softening slightly, then back to the boy. The boy's gaze never wavered. He stared at the dog with the unwavering certainty of someone too young to question himself. His words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to disperse. And in that moment, the balance of the courtroom shifted. The authority of the judge, the composure of the lawyers, the presence of the officer, all were challenged not by evidence or argument, but by a child's accusation. The interruption had come suddenly, like a crack of thunder in a clear sky. And though the room would eventually return to order, nothing could erase the echo of those words. "Bad doggy. You bite people." The gavel lowered again, the judge drawing in a long breath as he prepared to continue. But no matter how carefully he chose his next words, the courtroom was no longer the same. Something had changed. Something had been exposed. And everyone felt it. The words hung in the courtroom like smoke after an explosion, impossible to ignore, impossible to contain. "Bad doggy. You bite people." For a heartbeat, there was no movement at all. The entire room seemed frozen, as though time itself had been startled into stillness. The judge's hand hovered in the air, the gavel poised but unmoving. Lawyers stared wide-eyed, their pens held above their notepads. The clerk blinked rapidly, as if trying to decide whether she had truly heard what she thought she heard. Even the bailiff's chest seemed to still mid-breath. It was the kind of silence that wasn't just quiet, it was charged. Every pair of eyes in the room shifted toward the small boy in the back row, who sat with his face glowing in the pride of his declaration. The mother, by contrast, looked stricken. Her hand gripped her son's arm tightly, her lips trembling, as she whispered frantic apologies. She could feel the judgment of the room pressing down on her, the weight of 100 silent stares. She wanted to vanish, to sink into the wooden bench and disappear, but her son sat boldly upright, as if nothing were wrong. "Order," the judge finally said, his voice sharp but lacking its usual edge. He tapped the gavel once, but the sound rang strangely hollow in the silence. His eyes narrowed, fixed on the boy, then softened briefly when they shifted to the mother. He had presided over disruptions before, angry outbursts from defendants, shouted protests from family members, but never this. Never a child, so young and so unflinching, daring to speak aloud in the middle of a hearing. The officer with the dog shifted uneasily. His jaw tightened, the corners of his mouth pressed into a hard line. His grip on the leash grew firmer, as though he could anchor himself by holding on to the dog. He had heard accusations before, of course plenty of them, but coming from a toddler in the middle of a court with no prompting, that was different. That was dangerous in its own way. The German Shepherd itself remained unmoved, sitting upright, gaze fixed forward. Its ears twitched once, but otherwise it betrayed no awareness of the storm it had just been thrust into. To the dog, it was just another morning on duty. To the humans around it, however, the child's words cracked something open. A ripple of whispers spread through the gallery. Did he say what I think he said? He called the dog dangerous. He said it bites. Each murmur carried weight, the child's accusation multiplying in significance as it passed from mouth to mouth. People leaned toward one another, their eyes flicking nervously toward the officer, the dog, the judge. Some wore expressions of disbelief, others of unease. It was absurd and yet impossible to laugh at. The boy, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, repeated himself with even more determination. His small voice rose again, louder this time, filling the air. "Bad doggy, you bite people." The mother clamped her hand desperately over his mouth, her own voice breaking in a whisper. "Stop, stop, please." Her face burned crimson, her heart pounding. She felt as though the room itself might collapse on her, but it was too late. The words were spoken, and they could not be unsaid. The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. He was not a man easily rattled, but there was something about the purity of the child's words that unsettled him. He had heard testimony twisted, polished, reshaped to fit arguments. He had listened to lawyers bend the truth into something barely recognizable. But this was raw, unfiltered, uncalculated. The boy had no agenda, no reason to lie. And that, in its own way, made his words more powerful. "Order," the judge repeated, firmer now, his gavel striking once more. The crack echoed, breaking through the whispers, though not erasing the tension. His eyes moved to the mother. "Control your child, ma'am." Her throat tightened as she nodded quickly, holding her son tighter, whispering fierce commands into his ear. The boy pouted but finally fell silent, though his wide eyes still glared defiantly toward the dog. But the silence that followed was different from the one before. It wasn't calm, it was brittle, fragile, the kind of silence that could shatter at any moment. The attorneys shifted in their seats, exchanging quick glances. Some looked amused, though they dared not show it fully. Others looked troubled, as though the boy had voiced something better left unsaid. The bailiff crossed his arms, his gaze flicking uneasily between the bench and the gallery. The officer kept his face carefully blank, but a thin vein pulsed at his temple. He could feel the weight of every stare in the room, pressing against him. His partner, the dog, sat still, innocent in its discipline. Yet the boy's words had painted it with a brush of danger, and perception was often as powerful as fact. The judge cleared his throat and tried to resume. He spoke of procedures, of cases, of evidence. His voice returned to its steady cadence, but the room no longer received it the same way. The audience shifted in their seats, still glancing back at the boy, still glancing forward at the dog. Even the attorney's notes grew distracted, their pens moving slower across the page. The boy had stolen the focus of the room without even knowing it. And though he sat quietly now, his mother's arm wrapped firmly around him, her whispers sharp in his ear, his words lingered. They clung to the wooden walls, to the air above the benches, to the minds of everyone who had heard them. It wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, no fear of consequence. Just the clear, unshakable certainty of a child speaking what he believed to be true. And in a courtroom where truth was supposed to be the highest pursuit, that kind of unfiltered honesty carried a strange, unsettling power. The judge turned another page, continuing his work as though nothing had happened. But for the first time in years, his rhythm faltered. He paused too long between sentences. His words came slower. He found his eyes flicking toward the gallery. More than once, catching sight of the boy's small, defiant face. The courtroom carried on, but nothing about it felt the same. The child's words had lodged themselves like a splinter beneath the surface, small, simple, but impossible to ignore. And no matter how much procedure marched forward, that splinter would remain. The silence that followed the boy's outburst was not the ordinary quiet of a courtroom. It was thicker, heavier, like the air after lightning has split the sky. Something had been spoken that could not be withdrawn, and everyone in the chamber knew it. For a long moment, no one moved. The judge sat still at the bench, his hand resting on the gavel, but not striking it again. He had intended to resume the hearing, to push forward with the docket, as he always did, but the boy's words had wedged themselves in his mind. He tried to dismiss them, to remind himself that children say many things without understanding their meaning. Yet the certainty in the boy's voice, sharp, unwavering, echoed louder than any argument he had heard in years. "Bad doggy, you bite people." The words pulsed through the room like a refrain. The mother clutched her son tightly, her hands trembling as she pressed him against her chest. Her lips moved quickly, whispering apologies toward the judge, toward anyone who might be listening. Her face was pale, and her eyes darted from the bench to the officer to the gallery, searching for forgiveness that would not come. She rocked her child instinctively, as though motion might erase the weight of his words. But the boy, despite being muffled in his mother's arms, did not look remorseful. His face glowed with a strange mixture of defiance and innocence. He did not understand why the adults around him were staring, why his mother trembled, why the judge had stopped speaking. He only knew that he had spoken the truth as he saw it, and to him, that was enough. The officer with the dog stood rigid, his grip on the leash unyielding. His jaw worked as though grinding invisible stone. He was trained to face accusations, to endure suspicion, to carry the presence of authority, even under fire. But this was different. A toddler's voice had cut through the courtroom more effectively than any lawyer's objection or protest. And though the words were childish, they carried the sharp sting of implication. The gallery stirred uneasily. Some spectators leaned toward one another, whispering nervously behind their hands. Others sat frozen, their eyes darting between the boy and the dog. A woman in the second row pressed her fingers to her mouth, as if holding back a gasp. A man nearby shook his head slowly, muttering something under his breath. The murmurs built in waves, soft but insistent, until the judge finally struck his gavel against the wood with a sharp crack. Order. The word snapped through the air, but it did not erase the tension. It only pressed it down, forcing it to simmer just beneath the surface. The lawyers shifted in their seats. One adjusted his tie. His eyes narrowed as he studied the officer and his dog. Another scribbled a note on his pad, though his pen moved slower than before, his mind clearly elsewhere. They were men and women trained to find openings, to exploit weakness, and some of them wondered, quietly, whether a child's words had just exposed something raw. The judge's eyes swept the room, lingering briefly on the boy. His face softened for the briefest moment, then hardened again. He had no interest in losing control of the courtroom, but he could not ignore what had happened either. His gavel tapped once more, softer this time. "This court will proceed," he said firmly, but the weight in his tone betrayed him. Even as he spoke, he could not shake the child's accusation. The German shepherd remained calm, its posture unchanged. Yet in the silence, every flick of its ear, every slow blink of its eyes, seemed magnified. The boy's words had painted the dog in a new light. What had once been a symbol of discipline and control now seemed, in the minds of some, a creature of menace. It was unfair, perhaps even absurd, but perception had shifted. The boy wriggled slightly in his mother's grip, his eyes still locked on the animal. He seemed frustrated by the restraint, by the way his mother muffled his voice, as though the truth he wanted to speak had not yet been fully heard. His legs kicked restlessly against the wooden bench, small thuds echoing in the quiet. The mother pressed her lips to his ear, whispering frantically, "Enough, please, enough." Her voice trembled. She could not bear another word. The judge turned back to his docket, forcing himself to continue. His voice regained its rhythm, but the cracks were there. He stumbled slightly over one name, paused too long before another. It was clear to those watching closely that his focus was divided. He read the cases, called the motions, issued instructions. Yet all the while, the boy's words echoed in the background, refusing to fade. The attorneys listened, but their notes were distracted. Their minds replayed the scene, the child's sudden shout, the ripple of shock, the officer's stiffened stance. Some of them leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed, expressions skeptical. Others leaned forward, eyes sharp, as though already calculating how those words might be used later, in some other argument, in some other case. The spectators shifted again, their whispers softer now, but no less present. A mother with her teenage son leaned close, whispering, "Out of the mouths of babes, huh?" The boy rolled his eyes, but his gaze lingered on the police dog with new caution. The officer remained silent, his face locked in stone. Yet behind his eyes was a flicker of something unspoken. Frustration, maybe, or fear. Not of the dog, not of the boy, but of the moment itself. He had spent years training, years building the image of strength and trust that came with handling. K-9 unit. And in an instant, a toddler's words had cracked that image in front of a crowded room. The judge's voice droned on, but his eyes flicked back toward the gallery one more time. He saw the mother's trembling, the boy's restless defiance, the officer's rigid stance, the dog's stillness. He saw it all, and for the first time in a long while, he wondered what lay beneath the surface of the order he was tasked. Uphold. When the clerk read the next case aloud, her voice wavered. She, too, felt the weight of what had been said. The words were childish, yes, but they carried an unshakable ring of truth, the kind that could not be cross-examined, the kind that came from innocence untouched by calculation. The stunned reaction of the room lingered, long after the boy fell silent. And though the proceedings marched forward, no one forgot. Not the mother, whose hands trembled even as she tried to soothe her son. Not the officer, whose grip on the leash never loosened. Not the judge, whose words stumbled despite his best effort. Not the lawyers, who scribbled notes with distracted pens. Not the spectators, who whispered to one another in tones of unease. And certainly not the boy, who sat proudly, as if he had done exactly what he was meant to do. The courtroom had been shaken, and though order appeared restored, everyone in that room understood, on some level, that nothing had truly returned to normal. Because once spoken, the truth, even from the lips of a child, could never be unspoken. The gavel had struck twice. The judge's voice had regained its practiced cadence. On the surface, order had returned to the courtroom. But beneath that fragile surface, the atmosphere was unstable, charged like a storm waiting for release. The boy sat pressed against his mother's chest, his arms pinned gently but firmly by her embrace. She rocked him slowly, whispering apologies in frantic tones no one else could hear. Yet her trembling hands betrayed her fear, not fear of her son, but of what his words had done. She could feel the shift in the room, the way every glance seemed to carry judgment, suspicion, or something worse. The boy, however, seemed undeterred. His face remained alert, his wide eyes fixed on the police dog at the front of the courtroom. He was no longer fidgeting just from boredom. Now his body was taut with intent, as though he were waiting for the dog to move, waiting for the moment that would prove his words true. The German shepherd sat calm, its gaze unwavering, its posture rigid. But the boy's words had transformed. To some in the room, it was no longer just a disciplined animal. It was a shadow of danger, a creature cloaked in accusation. The officer holding the leash felt that shift acutely. He stood with his jaw clenched, his eyes staring forward, but his awareness sharpened to every whisper, every flicker of doubt. That crossed a face in the gallery. He had spent years building an image of strength and control, but a child's simple declaration had cracked it open. Now the silence felt hostile, as though the room itself questioned him. The judge pressed forward with the docket, his voice steady, his hands moving deliberately across the papers before him. But his mind wandered back to the interruption. He could not help it. The boy's words had carried a sting that procedure could not erase. Each time his eyes passed over the officer and his dog, the echo returned. "Bad doggy, you bite people." The murmurs began again, soft at first. A shuffle of papers, a low whisper behind a hand, the sound of shifting feet against the wooden floor. The gavel struck once more, but this time it did not quiet the unrest. It only masked it, like thunder rolling over distant voices. The mother's cheeks burned under the weight of those whispers. She bent lower, her lips brushing against her son's hair as she hissed in a voice cracked with desperation. "Enough. You must stop." But the boy wriggled. He turned his head just enough to free his lips from her shoulder. His eyes sharp, in their innocence, locked once more on the dog. His chest rose and fell quickly, his breath shuddering with determination. The moment stretched. The dog blinked slowly, tilting its head almost imperceptibly. To the boy, that movement was confirmation, proof of what he had known all along. His small hands pushed against his mother's arms, straining against her grip. His mouth opened. The courtroom held its breath. "No," his mother whispered harshly, but it was too late. The boy's voice rang out again, higher, louder, sharper than before. "Bad doggy, you hurt people." The words hit like a gunshot. Gasps broke out across the gallery. One woman clutched her chest. A man shook his head in disbelief. The clerk's pen fell from her hand and clattered against her desk. Even the attorneys, trained to keep composure, glanced up with startled eyes. The judge's gavel slammed down hard, the sound cracking through the chamber. Order! Order in this court! But order was gone. The gallery erupted in whispers, louder this time, unstoppable. Some leaned toward one another, their voices urgent. Did you hear that? The boy said it again. He says the dog hurts people. The mother buried her face in her son's hair, tears welling in her eyes as she tried to quiet him. But the boy twisted, his small voice rising above. The chaos, filled with the fearless conviction of innocence. Bad doggy, you're not nice. The officer's hand tightened on the leash until his knuckles turned white. He pulled the dog closer, his stance stiff, his face betraying nothing but a flicker of tension around his eyes. The German shepherd, trained and steady, gave no sign of aggression. But the boy's words had stripped away the calm veneer. Now, every tiny twitch of the animal, every shift of its paw, every flick of its ear seemed magnified, scrutinized by the eyes of the gallery. The judge rose from his seat. He had not intended to, but the room demanded it. His robe shifted as he stood tall, his voice booming. This court will come to order. The gavel slammed again, once, twice, 3 times. The murmurs faltered, but they did not vanish. The tension was too great, the boy's words too sharp. The judge's eyes swept the room, his gaze piercing. He saw the mother trembling her, face streaked with sweat. He saw the boy's defiant stare, unshaken even under the weight of his authority. He saw the officer's rigid frame, the leash drawn tight. He saw the dog, still calm, but caught in the center of suspicion. For the first time in years, the judge felt the control of his courtroom slipping. He was accustomed to anger, to outbursts, to defiance from grown men who knew the stakes of their cases. But this was different. This was a child, a voice too pure to dismiss and too disruptive to ignore. He drew a slow breath, forcing calm into his tone. Madam, he said, addressing the mother, remove your child from the courtroom immediately. The words struck the gallery like another gavel blow. Gasps, murmurs, uneasy shifting. Some nodded, as though it was the only sensible choice. Others frowned, sensing something unspoken in the air. The mother nodded quickly, her eyes wide with relief at the permission to flee. She gathered her son into her arms, whispering frantic apologies as she rose from the bench. Her legs trembled as she began to move toward the exit, clutching the child as though he might vanish if she let go. But the boy resisted. His small arms reached outward, his voice carrying once more over the hushed crowd. Listen, bad doggy. The mother stumbled, nearly dropping him as his voice echoed through the chamber one last time. The officer's jaw tightened, his eyes locked forward, refusing to meet the stares around him. The German shepherd shifted slightly, rising to its feet in a smooth, practiced motion. The leash went taut, and the gallery collectively exhaled, the sight of the dog standing sending a wave of unease through the room. The judge's gavel slammed again, his voice sharp. Remove them, now. The bailiff stepped forward to escort the mother and child, his expression unreadable. The boy kicked and shouted as they moved down the aisle, his small voice still defiant, ringing out one last time before the heavy doors closed behind them. Bad doggy, you hurt people. The door shut with a thud, sealing the words outside. But inside, the echo remained. The courtroom was silent once more, but it was no longer the silence of order. It was the silence of unease, of doubt, of something broken that could not be mended. The tension had not just cracked. It had broken, wide open, and everyone inside that room knew it. The heavy oak doors thudded shut, sealing the mother and child on the other side. The echo lingered in the chamber like the fading toll of a bell. Silence reclaimed the courtroom, but it was not the steady silence of authority. It was brittle, uneasy, the silence of a room holding its breath. The judge remained standing at the bench, his gavel pressed tightly in his hand. He had succeeded in restoring order in appearance only. Beneath the surface, he could feel the fracture, the sharp crack that no gavel strike could repair. The child's words, shouted with such fearless certainty, still rang in his ears. "Bad doggy, you hurt people." He lowered himself slowly back into his seat, the wood creaking beneath him. His eyes scanned the room. The gallery was filled with faces stiffened by discomfort. Some leaned forward, whispering softly. Others avoided one another's gaze, staring at their laps or at the polished floorboards. No one looked at the officer directly, though everyone thought of him. The officer stood motionless at his post, his hand still gripping the taut leash. His jaw was locked, his eyes forward, his expression carved from stone. Yet behind that mask was heat, anger at the boy's defiance, frustration at the whispers, unease at the shifting weight of suspicion. He felt every gaze, even when it was hidden. The German shepherd stood by his side now, its body tall and steady, head held high. To the officer, the dog was nothing but loyal, trained, obedient. Yet the child's voice had painted it with shadows that discipline could not erase. In the minds of the spectators, the dog was no longer just a symbol of order. It was a question mark, a threat unspoken. The gallery buzzed faintly, the sound of unease spreading like ripples in water. A woman leaned toward her neighbor, whispering, "He said it again." Her companion nodded, eyes darting toward the dog before quickly looking away. Another man rubbed his chin, murmuring, "Kids don't just say things like that. They—" Judge slammed his gavel once, not to silence them, but to steady himself. His voice followed, firm but edged with weariness. "This court will proceed with its docket." The clerk resumed her reading, her voice unsteady as she called the next case. Attorneys shuffled papers, cleared throats rose to speak. Procedure returned in form, but not in spirit. Every movement was slower, every word tinged with distraction. Even as legal arguments began to flow again, minds wandered back to the boy, to his voice, to his accusation. The mother was gone. The child was gone. Yet their presence was heavier in absence than it had been in the room. The judge shifted in his chair, listening but not fully hearing the lawyers before him. His eyes flicked toward the officer once, quickly, then back to the case. His duty was to weigh evidence, not whispers. And yet, the boy's words clung like burrs to his thoughts. "Bad doggy. You bite people." He had seen cases hinge on less. A phrase, a rumor, a single testimony, shaky but compelling. And here was a child, unprompted, uncoached, speaking as though he had seen something the rest of them had missed. The attorney at the podium cleared his throat nervously, his argument stumbling. He, too, was thinking of the outburst. His hands shuffled, the papers unnecessarily, his eyes flicking toward the officer before returning to the judge. Another lawyer whispered to his colleague, their heads bent low, though the tremor in their voices carried across the quiet room. The officer heard it all. His ears caught every half-hidden word, every fragment of doubt. His fingers twitched against the leash, and he forced himself to breathe evenly. He had endured harder stares before, harsher accusations, but never like this. Never in a room where silence was supposed to protect him. The dog shifted, sitting back down with a thud against the wooden floor. Its calmness seemed almost defiant, as if unaware of the storm it was accused of embodying. The gallery, however, flinched at the sound, eyes darted, shoulders stiffened. The boy's voice echoed again in their minds, louder now that the animal had moved. The judge felt the shift and struck the gavel again. "Focus yourselves," he commanded, though his own thoughts betrayed him. The hearing staggered forward, but the rhythm never recovered. Every case seemed perfunctory, every decision hollow. The words spoken by the lawyers, the rulings given by the judge, the notes scribbled by the clerk, all of it was coated in the residue of what had happened. The room was functioning, but it was not whole. When the final case was called, and the docket completed, the judge released a weary breath. He rose, his robe heavy, and dismissed the court. The gavel's last strike echoed sharp, but the sound was not one of closure. It was the mark of an ending that felt unfinished. The gallery emptied slowly, as though burdened by what they carried. Groups left in clusters, whispering to each other as they stepped into the hall. Some shook their heads, dismissing the boy's words as childish nonsense. Others walked quietly, unsettled by the conviction in his voice. But all of them remembered. The officer waited until the last had left, his dog still at his side. He did not look at anyone. He stood with rigid composure, his grip firm, his silence unbroken. But his heart pounded, and he knew, though no one had spoken it aloud, that something had shifted. The dog's loyalty was not in question. The boy's honesty was. Yet honesty, even from a child, carried power. It had pierced the veneer of order, had unsettled the court in ways that could not be unseen. The mother, in the hallway, clutched her son tightly. Her hands shook as she tried to calm him, her eyes darting in every direction. She feared judgment, reprimand, perhaps even punishment. But the boy seemed calm now, as though his task was done. His small hand rested on her shoulder, his wide eyes innocent, untroubled. He had spoken his truth, and to him, that was enough. Inside, the judge lingered alone after the room had emptied. His gavel sat before him, silent now. He rubbed his forehead with one hand, weary. He had presided over countless disruptions, but this one clung to him differently. Not because it had derailed the docket, but because it had pierced the heart of what a courtroom was meant to be. A place where truth was revealed. And this truth had not come from evidence or testimony. It had come from a child. He rose finally, gathering his papers, his steps slow. His face betrayed nothing, but in his chest he carried unease. Tomorrow would come, more cases, more hearings. But this day would follow him. He knew it. He felt it. In the stillness of the empty room, the words echoed one last time, faint but indelible. "Bad doggy, you hurt people." And though the courtroom, lights dimmed and the doors closed for the night, the fallout of those words stretched far beyond those walls. Because once truth had been spoken, whether childish or profound, it could never be contained again.